Hello and welcome. It's Jessica Drummond here from the Integrative Women's Health Institute. And today I have a fascinating webinar for you on the topic of the female hormone systems. This is essential knowledge for every women's health and wellness professional. So let's get started with Hormones 101. First of all, do not panic. I know that when many of us see these hormonal graphs and charts of the biochemistry and the interconnections, we freak out a little bit. Brings us back to those early college science classes. Do not panic. We're going to walk through this so you feel confident in your ability to understand these systems and to explain them to your patients and clients. We're going to cover today the basics of the hormonal pathways. How do sex, stress, and thyroid hormones interact with each other? Does your client have a healthy menstrual cycle? And we want to start looking at the menstrual cycle as a general indicator of health. Does your client have any red flags that the menstrual cycle is showing us that may, alert us to other potential problems with her general health? Also, it's very common that you'll be working with women with perimenopausal symptoms, things like anxiety, hot flashes, insomnia, fatigue, weight loss resistance, hair loss. And very often these women in their 40s and early 50s are living in the same house with teenage girls. And, these are two of the most in-need audiences in your community. These women and their daughters are seeking your help because a lot of these women have been struggling with hormonal imbalances all the way since puberty, or all the way since the birth of their first child, or all the way since, they were on birth control pills or they had a surgery. And so what they're seeking is their own health, and they are also looking for support to get their daughters starting off on the right foot. And we are going to complete this session with some basic nutrition and lifestyle strategies for healthy hormones for women, for teen and tween girls, through the whole lifespan, starting from puberty through menopause. So what are hormones? Well, today we are going to focus on, generally speaking, the steroid hormones. Most of the hormones we're going to be talking about are steroid hormones. They are composed of lipids, which are fats, and these are things like cortisol and sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. So one thing I want you to just take from this slide is that all hormones in these systems are derived from fats. So if your clients are on very low fat diets or they are very lean, that could actually be problematic for their hormonal health. The definition of a hormone is that hormones are chemical substances synthesized in small amounts by endocrine tissues and carried by the bloodstream to another tissue, where it acts there as a messenger to regulate the function of that target tissue or organ. So hormones travel throughout the body. Sex hormones, estrogen, for example, has more than 300 receptors in the body. If you don't have appropriate levels of estrogen, you're going to have issues even with your brain health. It's not just about reproduction. So we're going to talk through the basics of the hormonal pathways. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which you can think of as your built-in stress buffering system, as long as you don't abuse it. The hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, which regulates metabolism. Again, if it's not used and abused, then often it helps keep you at your healthy body weight. Interaction between the stress and the thyroid hormones, which happens very often when women have challenges with stress or chronic physical stress like inflammation, surgery, injury, illnesses, things like that. And the interaction between the stress hormones and the sex hormones, another key issue that we'll see a lot in our practices. So any kind of stressor, whether it's chronic inflammation, whether your client recently had an injury or surgery, whether it's an emotional stress or a lack of supportive community, any kind of stressor. The body doesn't distinguish very well between physical and emotional stressors, will impact the output of hormones from the brain. And these originate in the hypothalamus, and then they trigger the release of other hormones in the pituitary gland, which triggers the release of, in this case, adrenocorticotropin, which then triggers the release of the adrenal hormones. And there are two parts to the adrenal gland. These are small triangular shaped glands that sit right on top of your kidneys, and they support the release of glucocorticoid hormones, or cortisol, from the cortex, and noradrenaline and adrenaline from the medulla. So oftentimes, this message begins in the brain. And we're not going to talk a lot about the brain plasticity today, but just as a little side note, know that if we trigger the stress response very often, we actually support the plasticity, the wiring of the brain, to trigger more and more and more stress responses to smaller and smaller triggers. So we want to try to keep this stress response only activating when absolutely necessary. Additionally, when the adrenal glands are more depleted, then when actually this entire system is not functioning as robustly, then often instead of cortisol, which is a little bit of a healthier responder to stress, we'll get noradrenaline and adrenaline, or norepinephrine and epinephrine, which gives your clients more of an anxious, jittery feeling. And either of these hormones, any of these hormones, will also stimulate an immune response, increasing inflammation, which can come back up, cross the blood-brain barrier, or come and speak to the brain through the vagus nerve, again, triggering more of a stress response. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle that we want to use lots of little levers throughout this cycle to quiet that response whenever possible. So other things can trigger this response. So stress, we've talked about. Also, a lack of balance in circadian rhythms. So oftentimes your clients might be up late at night reading, on their phones or their iPads, or watching TV till 1 a.m. Anytime we are exposing ourselves to blue light after about 8 p.m., we have the potential to contribute to a dysregulation of these normal daytime, nighttime circadian rhythms. The other problem with circadian rhythms in modern society is that people are not outside exposed to sunlight enough, and especially without sunglasses, actually outside, there is a part of the brain, the SCN, that needs regular daylight stimulation also to maintain these rhythms. And we won't get into the full details of this diagram today, but just know that when there is a problem with physical emotional stress, or the circadian rhythms are out of balance, out of tune, then different nuclei in the brain trigger responses. This one is just what we saw in the previous slide. We have a response to the adrenal glands here through the pituitary adrenals. Then we have this release of cortisol, or it can also go through the spinal cord and upregulate or stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. Again, making your clients feel really jittery and anxious and alert, even at times when, maybe at 9 or 10 at night when they're trying to wind down and go to sleep. All right, so this is another representation of what we just talked about. We've got the hypothalamus in the brain, which secretes CRH, is the hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone from that part of the brain, which stimulates the pituitary gland, also in the brain, to release adrenocorticotrophin hormone, ACTH. This stimulates the adrenal cortex, which releases cortisol, and the medulla, which releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, if it's a nice, kind of normal amount of all of these hormones, and there is a stressor that needs some buffering, then this is very appropriate. The problem is when this system becomes hyperactive, right? We get way too much CRH, ACTH, and cortisol, and or epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what these hormones can do when it comes to the thyroid, so over here is the hypothalamus pituitary thyroid axis, which then stimulates different metabolic functions in the cell, helps your client grow thick hair and feel warm enough and not have any trouble maintaining her ideal weight. That's when this system is humming along. But the problem is that stress directly impacts this system and indirectly impacts this system. So if the stress response is upregulated and there's too much cortisol, epinephrine, and or norepinephrine, you will have blocks in various parts of this thyroid axis, making it difficult for the body's metabolic engine to keep humming. So TSH will be blocked. The conversion of T4 to T3, which is the active thyroid hormone that your client wants a just right amount of, when that is blocked, we've got a problem. So both of these systems need to be humming along smoothly for your client to feel nice and calm and focused, and also to normally and healthfully manage her blood sugar levels, which is very essential for life, and also to keep her metabolic engine moving along so she's not freezing with brittle hair and nails and having trouble losing weight. So let's look at now how these sex hormones fit in with all of this. Couple of different things. First of all, as we talked about, these hormones are all made from lipids or fats. So if your client does not have enough cholesterol, she cannot make adequate sex hormones. Cholesterol is required to make the precursor to all of the sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And you'll see that cortisol is down here. Remember, that was one of the key adrenal stress hormones. And if there is a stress incident and these other two, this other pathway is not creating as much cortisol as the body is asking for, because it's excessively stressed, then what it's going to do is come over to this sex hormone chart here and steal the resources, the cholesterol, the pregnenolone, this precursor to the sex hormones, steal these resources to make cortisol. So we call that the pregnenolone steal. And what happens is your client will then be low in estrogen and or progesterone and or testosterone because these resources are both required to make all of these. So cholesterol is important for making pregnenolone, which is then converted into progesterone. And you'll notice these little red and blue, like capsule-looking things. These are genetic markers or genetic, what we would call SNPs, certain genes. These are actually the representation of the gene. These genes make proteins, which in this case are enzymes, which help do things like change pregnenolone into progesterone. And if there's a problem with this gene in your particular client or a problem with these other genes in your particular client, you'll have trouble that the efficiency of her ability to turn fat into healthy stress hormones is going to be reduced because these, again, have to be humming along at all cylinders. And sometimes if these genetics are, predispose her to having less efficient creation of hormones, we can use simple nutrient supplements to support them to be more efficient, depending on where the little SNPs are in these various genes. this one, this one. So to just go through this chart kind of quickly so you get a basic understanding of it, and don't worry, again, you don't have to memorize all this at this point. In fact, I'll give you a link at the end so you can download these slides. So we've got cholesterol. It converts to pregnenolone and directly to progesterone if cortisol is not stealing it all, right? Then there are these other enzymes help to convert pregnenolone into other intermediaries like DHEA, eventually to androstenedione, which can then be converted into testosterone or estrogen, different estrogens. E2 is the one that we use during childbearing years primarily. And testosterone and estrogen can be converted back and forth to each other. Various kinds of estrogen can be converted back and forth to each other. And this little protein called sex hormone binding globulin is increased when a woman is on the birth control pill, and it binds up testosterone and estrogen, which is why women on the birth control pill often have more pain with orgasm or sex, and they may, for the long term, have lower libido. So that's an important little protein to understand. Now, it's actually good to have a reasonable amount of sex hormone binding globulin. We don't want all of our testosterone and estrogen floating around freely. That's not ideal. Having a healthy level of sex hormone binding globulin comes from eating plenty of fiber. Eating way too much fiber can actually cause a woman to have a problem with ovulation because she doesn't have enough estrogen, interestingly enough. But that's super rare in our current society. Very few of your clients are going to eat so many vegetables that they have so much fiber going on that they're going to bind up all their estrogen. But it is a risk. I have seen it clinically in a few clients who were in their late 20s, young women who were kind of dedicated yogi vegans. Like they were exercising quite a bit, doing yoga, but a lot of times like power yoga, hot yoga. And they were eating a very low calorie, low fat, high fiber vegetarian diet. And their sex hormone binding globulin was so high that they were actually having anovulatory cycles. Now, the other interesting thing about this slide is that estrogen is also broken down in a number of different ways so that it can be excreted from the body. And depending on which pathway it takes, it's more or less, puts that client more or less at risk for having breast cancer and other female cancers. The 2-hydroxyestrogen pathway is a safer pathway, less estrogenic, less cancer-causing than breaking down into high levels of 4-hydroxyestrogen. And if a woman is more inflamed, her estrogen breakdown metabolism is more likely to go down this path. Also, there could be a problem if she doesn't have enough antioxidants in her diet. And so this is the breakdown which happens in the liver, and then estrogen and testosterone are both converted, and then they enter the cell and they help the DNA transcribe various proteins. Healthy estrogen levels means healthy growth, healthy testosterone levels, also healthy robustness of the muscle fibers, healthy libido. So there are lots of benefits, healthy progesterone, lots of cellular benefits as well, and they act on the DNA. Estrogen is also important for keeping brain neurotransmitters at the right level. So if you've got a client who's got brain fog, or she's kind of forgetting words, she's having problems with her memory, and she's only in her 40s, it's not necessarily early Alzheimer's. She's just may not have adequate estrogen. So bring it back. Is she too stressed? Is she eating enough healthy dietary fat? Does she have any genetic SNPs in these important genes? So there's a lot we can work with here. We also want to start by assessing to see if our clients have healthy, normal menstrual cycles. One of the negatives to 80% of women being on the birth control pill is that we've forgotten that there are normal ebbs and flows to our menstrual cycles. The birth control pill keeps these hormones pretty steady throughout the month, which, can be good in some ways, can be appropriate for some clients. But there is a normal ebb and flow of all three of the common sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And you'll see on this chart, estrogen is the yellowish greenish line. Progesterone is like a darker purple that goes up in the second half of the cycle, and that blue half. And testosterone is kind of near the bottom, hovering near the bottom, but it goes up a bit right before ovulation, right there. It's kind of a bluish purple. So at the beginning of the cycle, so day 1 is when a woman starts bleeding. During those first few days when she has her period, her hormones are all at their lowest levels. So it's normal for her to feel a bit less supported, a bit fatigued, mild cramps, nothing that keeps her home, nothing that, interrupts with her life, but she may need to just take it a little easy those days. Then moving into like day 5, 6, and all the way up to day 14, where her estrogen and testosterone peak, she should be feeling really good. As I tell some of my clients, hey, if you're between puberty and menopause and you're not at least a little bit distracted by sex, like around day 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, then your hormones are not acting robustly enough for you. And you need that because it's not just about sex. It's about brain focus. It's about energy. It's about, getting out in the world and following your passion, right? We want to do this in this like pink time frame on this graph because our hormones are very supportive of us being extroverted and productive and focused and energetic. Again, if we're not feeling that approximately days 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, that is a problem, and we want to be working with those women. Then, after ovulation, roughly day 14, the pattern will shift, and progesterone dominates. Testosterone drops pretty low, so a woman not as interested in sex in the second half of her cycle, that's fairly normal. So she wants to, pay attention to her needs, her partner's needs, talk about when she's most interested, and tune into those normal flows. And estrogen will be sort of moderated. It's not as high as it was, but estrogen plays an interesting role in the second half of the cycle in collaboration with progesterone in helping women to be a bit more intuitive and collaboration between women, not necessarily working with other men, but working really well with other women, but could also be used as a competitive advantage in terms of, if your client is an athlete or they're negotiating a tough deal, they'll have an intuitive advantage during that second half of the cycle. And then elevations in progesterone help support really healthy, nourishing, supportive sleep. So again, if your clients are not sleeping well and easily through the night in the second half of the cycle, that's a red flag. We want to be looking at the health of her progesterone levels. And then again, just before her period starts at the end of the month, she may have a couple of days where she's a little more fatigued, a little more, mildly grumpy and mildly crampy. Anything beyond that is a red flag. Pain, significant pain, or even moderate pain anytime in the cycle is abnormal. And not feeling bursts of energy, not feeling good restorative sleep. These are also key red flags. So again, very painful periods, needing to miss work or school, including nausea, maybe other symptoms like headaches. This is a red flag. Any pelvic pain that is not related to the menstrual cycle is a red flag. Heavy bleeding, very light bleeding, missed periods or irregular periods, and PMS, including acne or mood changes. All of these are red flags. None of these are normal. And that's one thing that I think is an important job for us as women's health professionals is breaking that myth that our periods make us crazy, that our periods are painful. These are all myths that actually point to deeper general health problems. So these are the patients that are coming to you with these red flags that are ideal for your lifestyle medicine and nutrition kind of support when puberty and perimenopause live in the same house, right? So you can work with clients from the tween and teen years, often with their parents, addressing things like period problems, answering birth control questions, answering questions about their gynecologic health. Preconception preparation is a really hot growing area right now. Women are really seeking getting their bodies in their healthiest possible condition before they get pregnant, because it really makes a huge difference to the health of their babies, not just in childhood and infancy, but all the way through adulthood. And also sometimes women are coming to us with fertility challenges, difficulties with conception, pregnancy, postpartum, breastfeeding, all ideal client populations. And women that have symptoms related to hormones, fatigue, hair loss, cold intolerance, weight loss resistance, insomnia, breast tenderness, during cancer treatment or during the recovery from cancer, or during, kind of after cancer treatment and recovering and looking to prevent any cancer recurrence, perimenopause symptoms. And for those clients who have just recently had, or within the last couple of years, had a hysterectomy and don't feel like they fully recovered. So let's talk about healthy stress hormones, the causes of excessive physiologic stress responses, the symptoms of HPA axis dysfunction, and some nutrition and lifestyle strategies to help get that HPA axis and that stress response healthy again. So there are 4 general causes of stress. Perceived stress, anything emotional, new, unpredictable, lack of control. Just turn on cable news and you can induce some perceived stress in your body, right? Circadian disruptions, light-dark disruption. We talked about too much exposure to blue light, not enough exposure to daylight, jet lag, shift work. So you've got a lot of clients that are traveling across time zones or working the night shift. When there's increased inflammation, increased TNF alpha, interleukin 1B, interleukin 6, all of these other cytokines, these inflammatory chemicals that are circulating in excessive amounts through the body, which can come from anything from food sensitivities to chronic infections, anything that induces inflammation, obesity, excess adipose fat, especially in the abdominal region, and glycemic dysregulation, which basically means a blood sugar imbalance. So your clients are shaky when they don't eat. If they're feeling like they have that hangry feeling when they don't eat, or they feel really tired after they do eat, these are signs of blood sugar imbalances or glycemic dysregulation, which to the body is a stressor. So what is cortisol? Cortisol is the longer acting stress buffering hormone. It's primarily produced by the adrenal cortex. It raises blood sugar, blood pressure, and impacts inflammation. There are hundreds of other influences via glucocorticoid receptors, but these are the key ones that we're going to talk about today. Women require less cortisol to buffer stress when they use the tend and befriend response instead of the fight, flight, or freeze response. That is not the healthiest stress response for women. What are some of the targets of these stress hormones? Remember when I gave you the definition of stress hormones, or of hormones in general? These are chemicals that are secreted by endocrine tissue, but then they travel through the bloodstream to other targets. So some of the targets are executive and or cognitive, so the brain, the fear and anger and reward systems, which are also part of the brain, the wake-sleep centers of the brain, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, which keep those circadian rhythms normal, the growth, reproductive, and thyroid hormone axes. So those are the more endocrine axes, the biochemistry that I showed you in the very beginning with all of those charts and graphs, as well as the gastrointestinal system. So if hormones are out of balance, your clients can have diarrhea, constipation, stomach pain, bloating, cardiorespiratory problems, metabolic issues, and immune issues. So these are going to be some of the symptoms related to when you don't have adequate or you have too much of these different hormones, and they land in their receptors and they trigger these symptoms. Brain fog, or memory issues, anxiety, insomnia or night waking, thyroid problems, infertility, hot flashes, vaginal dryness, digestive issues, heart palpitations, dysglycemias or, either low or high blood sugars, chronic cold and flus, and susceptibility to autoimmune conditions. So you want to start to get comfortable with cortisol rhythm testing. It's a simple saliva test. You can have your clients order it for themselves, or you can collaborate with their physicians or other licensed health providers to order these tests. This is important to start looking at because the absolute amount of cortisol at any given moment isn't as important to understand as looking at the whole rhythm. And we teach in the Hormones 101 course really how to assess these curves, because during different times of the day, if you'll notice the example on the bottom right, there, we kind of want a pretty high little burst of cortisol in the morning. And you'll see this client, the black line, this is her results, is skating right along the bottom of the chart almost the whole day. In the morning, there should be a little burst of cortisol, a moderate burst of cortisol. So it's up around 8 would be optimal, where your client feels awake and like ready to tackle the day. Yay! When she's down at 4 or 3.5, like she is on this graph, she's like, where's the coffee, right? Another day at this office, I can't stand it, right? She needs that little burst to get her up in the morning. Now, if it's too high, notice on the left, she's up at like 11. She might wake up with a lot of anxiety. It's like, oh no, I've got to fight the traffic. I've got to, drive that 45-minute stressful commute. I'm already she's like having coffee and she's already overstressed and it's like too much. So there's a nice balance between like can barely drag herself out of bed and is like jittery and nervous when she just barely gets out of bed. And then we want that level to stay around the green line, low, but a little bit of cortisol throughout the day. So she has her energy to just live her life. If it's really low, again, this client is super fatigued. Notice on the bottom right that the nighttime reading is at the very top of the normal night range. And especially since the whole rest of the day was quite low, she's going to be one of these women who's like, can't get up in the morning. And she's so tired, but she's jittery. She can't fall asleep at night. So you'll see her self-medicating on what I call the coffee wine diet, right? Coffee to get up in the morning, wine to try to quiet her and calm herself down at night. It's not very effective, but it's how people try to self-medicate when their cortisol curves look kind of flatlined, that bottom right. So if the cortisol curve is off, your client has HPA axis dysregulation. Why is it happening in this particular client? Well, that's why you want to go back to the 4 most common causes of stress. Use your health coaching communication skills. If you don't have health coaching communication skills, join our Women's Health Coach certification. We teach tons and tons, months and months of health coach communication skills. Is there a perceived stress, a new stressor, something unpredictable going on in her life, some kind of lack of control, an emotional stress, or is there a physical stressor, a lot of inflammation? She's eating a lot of processed foods, not enough nature, sunlight, not enough social support, not enough sleep. She was recently in an accident or had a surgery or an injury. Many different things can cause stress. Is she struggling with circadian disruption? Is she eating an inflammatory diet? Is she exercising excessively? Is she inflamed for some other reason? Or is her blood sugar out of balance? It might be if she's starting her day with coffee and ending it with wine and eating bursts of sugar throughout the day to try to maintain her blood sugar. So these are the women we see with a lot of fatigue, but they also have a lot of sugar and carb cravings. And this is what that blood sugar roller coaster looks like, right? She wakes up in the morning, she's dragging. So she has her coffee and her bagel. Her blood sugar shoots right up. Her insulin also shoots right up because that's a dangerous situation for her brain and heart tries to quickly get all that excessive blood sugar out of her bloodstream, drops like a rock her blood sugar. Then she feels jittery, anxious, starving, needs to eat. This is how I was when I was working in the hospitals, and I used to wear my lab coat and carry around, power bars and granola bars and snack bars. I couldn't be anywhere without food because there were just times that I felt so jittery. So if you or your client are relying on energy bars, there's a blood sugar stability problem. If you don't feel like you can leave the house without food, there is a blood sugar stability problem. All right, so what are we going to do to get that HPA axis back in balance? I always start with an elimination diet. You can use IgG testing. It's not as evidence-based, but it can help guide elimination diet specifics. Have your client start with a whole foods breakfast. Focus on healthy fats and proteins within 30 to 60 minutes of waking. You may need to retrain your client's taste buds so that they'll eat more savory foods for breakfast and not just coffee and donuts. The client should eat every 4 to 6 hours. We want to kind of preempt any significant blood sugar drops, but over time, as she's eating less and less sugar, more and more protein and healthy fats and vegetables, she'll be able to last longer without her blood sugar being unstable. So ideally, we want about 6 hours between meals so that the GI system has a chance to do what it's supposed to do and have some rest. So we don't end up causing bacterial overgrowths and things if we're just eating all day long without a rest to the digestive system. But blood sugar is the first priority. So eat as often as necessary to preempt any big blood sugar swings at first. At every meal and snack, she needs to be eating clean protein, healthy fat, and fiber, primarily from vegetables or low glycemic fruits. Limit or completely eliminate sugar, including sometimes, all these natural sugars and honey and, fruit, tropical fruits, dried fruit. Restore nutrient deficiencies. I use organic acids testing primarily. Spectracell testing can be useful. Chromium, biotin, cinnamon, and fiber also help with blood sugar balance, and adaptogenic herbs as needed. Be very mindful, of using these supplements until you really understand the biochemistry behind them. Chromium in particular, especially if your client is on a diabetic medication, can actually cause low blood sugar episodes, which can be dangerous. For lifestyle, no sugar, alcohol, or caffeine, or as little as possible. Massage at least 1 to 4 times per month. Orgasm regularly. Now, for some women, this is nourishing. Those are the ones that want to be doing it as much as possible. For others, orgasm can feel depleting. So really depends on your client. It's kind of like exercise. We have to gauge how it feels. Yoga, Tai Chi, diaphragmatic breathing, relaxation response in any way, which is one of the reasons why massage works really well, sometimes acupuncture. Radical self-care, laptop curfew. So turn off those blue lights by 8 p.m. If you don't take anything else from my lecture today, take that. And sleep. Sleep is so underrated. All right, so when the thyroid, now let's move on to the thyroid. When the thyroid is out of balance, you or your client feels out of balance. So let's talk about some of the symptoms and then what we can do about it. Thyroid hormones regulate breathing, heart rate, central and peripheral nervous systems, right? So if they're short of breath a lot, heart palpitations, anxiety, pain sensitivity, regulates body weight. So they'll be having that abdominal fat that they can't shake. Muscle strength. So like they'll easily fatigue with exercise. They can't build muscle. Menstrual cycles will be irregular. Their body temperature will be off. That's why they feel cold hands and feet. And their cholesterol levels will be out of balance. Also things like hair loss, brittle nails. So when we're talking about thyroid testing, TSH guidelines on a lot of different labs are not so great. The evidence, so this was published most recently, I believe in 2005. And even still, this is about a decade old research, even still a lot of the labs have not caught up. Recent laboratory guidelines from the National Academy of Clinical Biochemistry indicate that more than 95% of normal individuals have TSH levels below 2.5. The remainder with higher values are outliers, most of whom are likely to have underlying Hashimoto's thyroiditis or other causes of elevated TSH. Importantly, data indicating that African Americans with very low incidence of Hashimoto's has a mean TSH level of 1.18, strongly suggesting that this value is the true normal mean for that population. So what we really want to see is a level of about between 0.3 and 1.5. Sometimes going up to about 2 is okay, but going past 2, even if the range is up to 3, 4, or 5, starts to get dangerous. Here are some other ideal ranges functionally. And so Hashimoto's thyroiditis is an autoimmune form of thyroid disease. It's the body attacking your own thyroid. So if there are any TPO antibodies, even a small amount, this will predict a higher risk of developing overt hypothyroidism later in life. Very small increase. It raises the concern that such patients may also be at increased risk for developing other autoimmune diseases, even including type 1 diabetes, later in life. So there is an increase in autoimmune type 1 diabetes occurring not just in childhood, but in adulthood as well. And then free T4, as we saw way back in that biochemical chart, that's the original hormone that's secreted from the thyroid. Then it has to be converted to free T3, where it is active in the body, in the cell. And that conversion can't happen if your client is low in nutrients or too high in cortisol, because cortisol blocks that conversion. So what are some things we're going to do to support the thyroid to thrive? Well, we have to have a very nutrient-dense diet, as you saw from that chart, all through the pathway from the brain to the thyroid to the cell. A lot of vitamins and minerals are required for all of those processes to happen normally. So healthy copper and zinc levels, selenium, vitamin A, vitamin D, iodine, ferritin. The goal for ferritin, which is the best measure for iron in the serum, is between 70 and 90, which is pretty high, but normal, healthy, robust. Vitamin C helps to increase the absorption of iron-rich foods and supplements. All kinds of nutrient-dense nutrition, high protein, high healthy fat, high vegetable. Definitely want to be eliminating gluten. Gluten mimics thyroid tissue, and gluten have molecular mimicry, meaning that if your client is sensitive to gluten, her immune system will attack not just gluten, but the thyroid, which looks the molecules of the thyroid, which look like gluten molecularly. An increased prevalence of celiac disease is found in patients with autoimmune thyroiditis. And we also want to avoid foods that commonly cross-react with gluten, things like dairy, oats, yeast, instant coffee, milk chocolate, millet, soy, corn, rice, and potatoes. Lots of micronutrients. What is depleting? So if your client on organic acids or SpectraCell has really low levels of micronutrients, what's going on? Is she just not eating them? Does she need to go back? Do you need to go back and really assess her digestion? Is she under a lot of stress, making it hard for her to absorb the nutrients? Lack of sun, not even enough raw food, not chewing and digesting her food well. She may need digestive enzyme kinds of supplements. So lots of easy to digest foods that are very high in nutrients. Bone broth, magic mineral broth, blended soups, animal proteins that are well cooked, and she really chews them well and uses appropriate HCl or digestive enzyme support. Sleep is essential for thyroid. Partial sleep restriction was accompanied by a modest but statistically significant reduction in TSH and free T3. And this was seen mainly in women. So these issues are not the same across genders. Women have certain vulnerabilities when it comes to these endocrine systems. All right, so I get into much more thyroid strategies and much more stress buffering strategies in our Hormones 101 course, but we only have so much time today. So let's move on to healthy sex hormones. Let's talk about the core causes of sex hormone imbalances, which we touched on in the beginning here, symptoms, and what we can do about it. So I talked about the pregnenolone steal. This is a little bit of a prettier chart that you can post or print and show your clients so they don't have to get bogged down in all the other biochemistry. At the end of the day, if your body is stressed, then the resources necessary to create cortisol, which is our main stress buffering hormone, will be diverted, stolen by those needs, and more cortisol will be made at the expense of all of the other sex hormones. Survival, and this is really what survival looks like, right? Buffering us from stress rather than giving us the tool we need to reproduce. Survival will always be a priority over sex and reproduction in nature. That's why we have to always start with the HPA axis. That is the key. Now, the other key thing we have to understand, and I got this kind of perspective from Dr. Burdett in Atlanta, Dr. Cheryl Burdett. It's not just about the hormones. Remember when I talked about the sex hormones, their metabolism can go in a various number of different pathways. And some of those pathways are healthier than others. And so some of the direction of which pathway the metabolism will kind of move down depends on whether or not the body is inflamed. So when the body is chronically inflamed or even acutely inflamed, but it's more of an issue if it's chronically inflamed, hormone balance will by definition be altered. When there is increased oxidative stress, high F2 isoprostanes, which is a marker of inflammation, and low glutathione, which is an important antioxidant in the body. We do a lot of glutathione supplementation. It's a little tricky because you can't use just plain glutathione. It won't transverse through the stomach. It'll be broken down, but we do have liposomal glutathione and other kinds of glutathiones that we can use now. If you have high inflammation, low antioxidants, that's really what the bottom line is. Glutathione is a key antioxidant, and F2 isoprostane is a key inflammatory marker. So high inflammation, low antioxidants, you will have increased risk of estrogenic cancers and metabolism to more dangerous cancer-causing estrogen metabolites. So if we look at some of the testing, and this is from a Dutch test, you'll see that, so there are several kinds of estrogen metabolites here, 16, 2, and 4. We didn't get into 16 in the other graph, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. 16 is kind of a problem child, moderately problematic. 4 is quite problematic. 2 is normal. So with this client, she's got a favorable 2 to 16 ratio. So she's got actually high 2 hydroxyestrone, which if we go and look at the rest of this test, my guess is her estrogen in general is a bit high. So that's an issue we have to work on. But so generally speaking, she's breaking down a large number of her estrogens through this favorable metabolic pathway, but there's also an elevation going on here, which could be problematic. So we need to pay attention to that and look at, does she have any elevated inflammatory markers or any reason why we think she might be inflamed? She gets really sore after working out really quickly, or, she doesn't have that 2-day delayed onset muscle soreness, but the soreness happens like right away or the next day. That's a red flag for inflammation. Or if she has belly fat that she can't get rid of, that's a red flag for inflammation. Or she may have skin inflammation like chronic eczema or psoriasis, another red flag. So what do we do about this? Well, go back and balance her stress hormones. Then look at what underlying causes of chronic inflammation might she have. Is she eating a bunch of sugar? Is she eating a bunch of processed foods? Is she carrying around extra weight? Is she stressed about something? Is she over-exercising? Does she have some kind of underlying chronic infection? Then we find and address the sex hormone balance. So, for example, and again, we don't have time to get into every sex hormone imbalance in this lecture, but let's start with estrogen. This is a really common issue, having too much estrogen. Now, interestingly, a lot of times in your perimenopausal clients, you'll also see this postpartum. Estrogen levels will be high relative to progesterone, but both may be low. So in either case, if that's the circumstance, you want to actually raise estrogen, but in concert with really focusing on raising progesterone, because the estrogen to progesterone ratio is a key indicator of hormonal balance. All right, but let's talk about just pure too much estrogen. So she's going to be feeling breast tenderness, heavy periods, may have ovarian cysts, fibroids, things like that. Could also be related to endometriosis, and may have menstrual migraines. So obesity can be a cause of excess estrogen. Her fat cells also produce estrogen. When premenopausally, so in the childbearing years, there is extra fat, which produces a certain kind of estrogen that's actually a little less estrogenic than that E2, that estrogen of childbearing women, childbearing age. So she may have actually lower levels of estrogen. Post-menopausally, fat is even more of a problem, though. Her estrogen levels can be higher. And again, that's a cancer risk. All right. So then and also just as a side note, if she has high body weight and high estrogen levels because she's just carrying extra fat, that's not so good for bone health. Estrogen is actually helpful for bone health. We want a good right size amount of estrogen. Estrogen is not good to be too low either. If it's too low, then your clients are going to be struggling with infertility and fragile bones and, poor heart health. So estrogen is ideal. We don't want it to be too high or too low. Having too much insulin, so eating a high sugar diet, can increase estrogen. Hormones might be added to meat or dairy. And in fact, organic milk is actually, I guess the cows are milked when they are pregnant. So even organic milk does have excess estrogen. Alcohol also raises breast cancer risk. And when clients are low in certain B vitamins, have certain genetic SNPs like we talked about, and don't get enough healthy amino acids, maybe they're not eating enough animal protein, that can make it tougher to detoxify estrogen. Now, vegetarians can healthfully detoxify estrogen, and even vegans. A lot of times they don't have as much estrogen because they're having a lot of fiber. But be careful, because sometimes they're eating way too much soy, which can be problematic when it comes to estrogen. And then stress can also increase estrogen. The symptoms of a woman who has too much estrogen: she'll have breast tenderness, painful periods, PMS, endometriosis, mood swings, irritability, headaches, breast and endometrial cancer. So if there is too much estrogen, or there is too much estrogen compared to progesterone, here are some things we need to watch out for. Pesticides, so switching to an organic diet, making sure she's not working on a pesticide-heavy farm, reducing their exposure to BPA and phthalates, birth control pills. Now remember, about 80% of American women at some point take birth control pills. 100% of those women pee, and 0% of our water treatment plants deal with that. So drink filtered water, or you are drinking hormones from birth control pills. Household cleaners, industrial chemicals, and heavy metals all influence estrogen levels badly. And then eat foods to help detoxify the system of excess estrogen. High in cruciferous vegetables, and avoid sugar-sweetened drinks, because those are directly related to endometrial cancer. Now, if your client has too little estrogen, she may have too little body fat. She's over-exercising. Maybe she has an eating disorder. She may have too much fiber. We talked about this, those kind of high-power, vegan, vegetarian, just committed women. There's many benefits to that in terms of cancer, but it is a problem for low libido. It's actually a cardiac risk and can lead to vaginal dryness, painful sex, and infertility. So the diet has to be high in healthy fats. For active women, should be about 30% healthy fat, a lot of fat. And birth control pills, because these do elevate sex hormone binding globulin, that little protein that I told you about in the beginning that binds up our testosterone and estrogen, and can often stay elevated even after women go off the birth control pill, sometimes permanently. Symptoms of too little estrogen, irregular cycles, low libido and ovulatory cycles, vaginal dryness. Now, it's normal at certain times of life to have lower estrogen, for example, postpartum. So if a woman's breastfeeding and she has vaginal dryness, this is normal. We don't actually, we can certainly give her lifestyle strategies to support estrogen, but she doesn't need, added hormones. This is a natural kind of natural birth control, and it's fine. Now, she might want to use lubrication. She might want to use some estrogen support supplements, but she doesn't, this is something we sometimes sort of like feeling the ebbs and flows of our menstrual cycles. We have to remember that we are connected to nature, and there are times in life when we're designed to be kind of tuned in and taking care of ourselves and taking care of our babies and not necessarily having a lot of sex. And that's okay. That's normal and healthy. But if your client wants to have sex, or, it's part of something she's feeling like she's missing, there are ways to make it more enjoyable and more comfortable, even when her estrogen is relatively low. Now, in perimenopause, estrogen levels can also be low, but they shouldn't drop too low. The adrenal glands actually secrete plenty of estrogen if the HPA axis is not all depleted to carry a woman through menopause all the way into her older years. There are some countries where the language does not even include a word for hot flashes. And that is because these women have robust HPA axes and are able to more gently and joyfully glide through menopause rather than dragging themselves through it with very low estrogen. And painful sex is another sign of too little estrogen. So how do we raise estrogen? Eat more fat, stop drinking alcohol, or at least drink fewer than 4 glasses of wine per week, or 4 drinks. Eliminate completely if you're at risk for breast cancer. Stop drinking caffeine. Eat organic vegetables and fruits high in vitamins E and C, that should say. Add pomegranate, which has some fascinating literature behind it. I'll get into it later in the Hormones 101 course. And consider eating more traditional soy in small amounts, more of a condiment amount, like organic miso or tofu. Fermented forms of soy are good. And again, soy depends entirely on the woman. There is no such thing as is soy good or is soy bad. It depends entirely on the woman, her needs, her ethnicity, her childhood exposure to soy, her genetics, her gut microbiome. That is a whole conversation in and of itself. All right. So in summary, to work with any women, you have got to have a foundational understanding of the female endocrine system. Start by understanding the biochemical hormonal pathways. They interact with each other. They interact with your client's genetics. They interact with her digestive function. If she cannot absorb nutrients, none of these systems are going to be working well. They interact with her immune system. Remember the huge influence that inflammation plays on the endocrine systems. And symptoms are often related to the functions of the target tissues. It's not always about sex and reproduction. It's about feelings of calmness. It's about energy. It's about metabolism. And it's about brain function and heart function, which we didn't really get into today, but also very important. Stress is usually at the root of a hormonal imbalance. Now, that can be a physical stress, but it can also be an emotional stress, a financial stress, a career stress, relationship stress. Nourishment of hormones starts with whole foods, nutrient-dense, free of chemicals, not full of chemicals, free of chemicals. So let go of the pesticides, of the phthalates and parabens and all your skincare and cosmetics, right? We've got to stop dropping these small amounts of chemicals into our bodies all day, every day. They really do disrupt the hormonal systems. We need to be assessing for micronutrient deficiencies and digestive function problems. And if it's autoimmune related, be mindful of cross-reactivity and molecular mimicry. Those clients who are at risk for autoimmune issues need to be much more careful about that elimination diet assessment. So to learn more, I've actually got a link for you here where you can download the slides from this lecture. So you can review it, look through it, take some notes. We covered a lot in this session, but this is a big topic. So I created the Hormones 101 course, the program, and you can learn more about that on the page below. You can connect with me at the Integrative Women's Health Institute, which is integrativewomenshealthinstitute.com, or on Facebook at facebook.com/integrative pelvic health. We actually changed our name a few years ago. That was what we used to be. All right, it was my pleasure to share with you this information about hormones today in this webinar. Join us for the Hormones 101 program if you would like to dig even deeper, and join me on our live Q&A calls and ask questions in our professional Facebook group, because this is a topic that could take weeks, months, and years to really explore. But the best way to explore it is to learn the information, begin to use it with yourself and your clients, and then come back to me with questions, which you can do for as long as you need while you're in our program. All right, great to see you. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.